The menstrual cycle. Throughout this video, I want to speak to you about the menstrual cycle and how it can potentially impact strength training related goals and fat loss related goals. And the reason why I want to break this down to you is because the potential differences, or the potential impact I should say, that the menstrual cycle can have are too significant to ignore. And the last thing I want you to do is potentially beat yourself up or blame a lack of willpower on normal bodily functions. So throughout this video, regardless of whether you have a menstrual cycle, your partner, someone you know, then I want you to keep watching, because this video could be the game changer that you need to help you move forward and make very, very good progress when it comes to strength training, fat loss, and the menstrual cycle. Although before I get started, I do quickly want to say, if you're not subscribed to the channel already, then please do subscribe, because it helps immensely. Otherwise, let's just get stuck in. So before we get started on more specifics, it could be good to briefly explain what the menstrual cycle is. So many people, primarily those who don't experience a menstrual cycle, typically assume that it's just one bad week, which is the week of your period. And this assumption couldn't be more inaccurate, because the menstrual cycle is actually a whole chain of activities which lasts typically for about 28 days and involves the brain, the ovaries, the uterus, and it starts on the first day of your period and ends on the last day before your next period begins. So now we've briefly introduced what the menstrual cycle is, let's briefly also introduce each phase of the menstrual cycle. So like I said, the typical menstrual cycle lasts for about 28 days. The first 2 weeks, roughly speaking, is what's called the follicular phase. The last 2 weeks, again typically speaking, and the reason why I say that is because it will slightly vary from person to person, is what's called the luteal phase. And then a few days in between both the follicular phase and the luteal phase, it's what's called ovulation. And ovulation is the most fertile phase of the entire menstrual cycle. So now let's go into more depth within each phase, and I'm going to start off with the follicular phase, and I'm going to cover both week 1 and week 2. So generally speaking, the follicular phase is the best time to take advantage of your body and hormones when it comes to both resistance training and fat loss related goals. And the reasons why I say this is because, number one, appetite is generally lower than it is compared to the luteal phase. So that's already going to help on the fat loss side of things. And then when it comes to strength training specifically, you can also tolerate more volume during the follicular phase. And this is backed up by research. I'm going to speak about the research more shortly. So this isn't just, my random opinion. So again, you can tolerate more volume, injury rates are generally lower during the follicular phase, and you have more normal rates of body coordination. So like I said, this does make the follicular phase the ideal time to start with fitness related goals, as long as you're not the type of person that's always leaving it for next Monday. If that's you, then just start now. Anyway, now to expand more on the follicular phase and to bring up a study. So the studies that I mentioned, one of them is a study by Sung et al. From 2014. And within this study, they looked at 20 females with an average age of 26. None had a prior history of resistance training, and all of them had regular 28-day cycles, give or take 2 days. And throughout the study, the 20 females trained 4 times a week throughout 3 menstrual cycles, and their training consisted of single leg presses and single leg squats. Although here's where the study by Sung et al. From 2014 gets even more interesting, because each participant then trained one leg 8 times within the follicular phase, and then twice within the luteal phase. And then they trained their other leg 8 times within the luteal phase and twice within the follicular phase. And then after 3 months of consistently training 4 times a week, the outcomes showed that the leg that was trained 8 times within the follicular phase actually had increased strength and increased muscle. And you have to remember as well, those improvements happen with volume being equal on each leg. Although of course you could always say that that was just a coincidence and that 20 participants isn't enough for a study. Although you will find that other research studies that are measuring something similar point in similar directions as well as to the results that Sung et al. From 2014 found. And just to further prove this, another study by Witch and Frizen et al. 2017, I really hope I pronounced that surname correctly, apologies if I didn't, also measured something similar where they had 2 groups of 19 females, so 19 females in one group and then 19 females in another. And then both groups performed high frequency leg training for 2 weeks of each menstrual cycle for 4 months. And then in the remaining part of the cycle, they performed resistance training just once a week, with the overall results then showing that even though everyone in both groups completed 48 workouts in total, the group who performed most of their strength training within the follicular phase again had more muscle gain. And that is quite interesting, isn't it? So as you can see, there is a recurring theme there, and a lot of research has started to back this up. Now, with the follicular phase briefly out of the way, let's go into more depth within the final 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle, aka the luteal phase. So now when it comes to the luteal phase, just like I did with the follicular phase, I'm going to speak about both week 1 and week 2. And to continue on the subject of resistance training, studies do show that a slight drop in coordination does tend to happen. And because handling free weights requires more coordination, it could potentially be a good idea to prioritize more machine-based movements during the luteal phase, such as quadricep extension machines, leg presses, hamstring curls, chest press machines, etc., etc. And then when it comes to nutrition specifically, a hormone called progesterone increases during the luteal phase, which therefore means that appetite and hunger tends to be higher during the luteal phase. So an interesting study by Pliner in 1983 followed about 34 females in which they measured their food preferences and their average caloric intake during each phase of the menstrual cycle. And the results were quite interesting because during the luteal phase, so again the final 2 weeks, females on average tended to consume a considerably higher amount of calories. And if I'm not wrong, it was about 250 more calories on average. And that was something that was consistently happening. And then a study by Barr in 1995 also echoes something similar, in which they found that 42 females on average consumed about 305 calories more, specifically within the luteal phase, compared to the follicular phase. So again, there is a recurring theme amongst the different studies. And overall, these findings do seem to consistently show that it can be harder to stick with fat loss related goals during the luteal phase, so the final 2 weeks of your cycle, compared to the follicular phase. So now we've gone deeper into some of the research surrounding both the follicular phase and the luteal phase. Let's speak about a few potential ways as to how we can work around or even with these to help you continue making progress moving forward and to not feel so frustrated. So after what we've discussed so far, it could be quite easy just to say, okay, the follicular phase is good and the luteal phase is bad. But here's the thing. First of all, you have to remember that although some research does show that the luteal phase can be a tougher time when it comes to both fat loss and strength training related goals specifically, the menstrual cycle serves many other purposes outside of this video's discussion. So that's first of all. Secondly, there are absolutely ways you can keep making progress, into which I'm going to go into more depth on now. And then thirdly, you have to remember that the studies I would have mentioned throughout, as well as many other studies out there, in fact, is always going to mention the average finding amongst a large group of people. But you're an individual, you're not an average. So you're always going to have to remember that moving forward. So you could very well potentially feel quite different to what's been mentioned throughout. So as promised, let's speak about how you can work alongside your menstrual cycle specifically for fat loss. I'm going to do resistance training specifically shortly, but for now we'll do fat loss. So if we take into account the findings from Pliner in 1983 and Barr in 1995 and work alongside that average 300 calorie increase in appetite during the luteal phase, so the final 2 weeks, then it could be a very good idea to consider spending the follicular phase, so the first 2 weeks of the cycle, within a calorie deficit for fat loss, because a calorie deficit, put very simply, of course, is the only way to lose fat. Of course, there's other factors that come into it, but calories are going to be the ultimate dictator of it. So spending the first 2 weeks within a calorie deficit, so the follicular phase, and then the luteal phase, so the final 2 weeks within maintenance. And that could be potentially something that you consider. And I know what you're thinking on the back of this, or you could potentially be thinking this is, Leo, I don't want to spend half of every single month within maintenance. I want fat loss results now. And to that, I say, here's what you need to remember moving forward. A diet that you can stick to for 2 weeks every single month, 10 times out of 10 trumps a diet that you can never stick to. And by diet, I just mean your everyday nutrition. I don't necessarily mean some sort of weight loss regimen. Because with that 300 calorie increase during the maintenance phase, chances are your consistency levels are also going to go up, as I just said. And if your consistency levels go up, then chances are you're going to be sticking with all the other healthy habits that you should still be doing anyway, which also means that motivation is going to stay higher, which obviously therefore means if motivation is higher, healthy habits are still there, consistency is higher, you are going to have an easier time on your overall fat loss journey. And to not overcomplicate it in any sort of way as well, 300 calories could literally come in the form of 3 portions of fruit. And then another game changer, and this could be a massive game changer for how you measure your fat loss, could come in the form of how you're tracking your data. And by this, I mean scale weight and measurements. What you potentially are doing right now, which is where you're weighing yourself on Monday and then you expect your scale weight to go down on Tuesday. And that is not a good idea. And the reason why I say that is because fat loss does not work like that. Fat loss does not work like that quickly. Fat loss takes time. And you might not be doing it on back-to-back days. Maybe you're doing it on back-to-back weeks, which is obviously better than back-to-back days, but it's still quite quick for fat loss. So maybe instead of doing it on back-to-back days, you might be maybe taking your scale weight on week 1 and then expecting it to go down on week 2, which is, again, like I said, better than the first, but still not ideal. And by this, I mean, what could be a much better idea moving forward is instead you compare your average scale weight of week 1, let's say week 1 of May, to your average scale weight of week 1 in June, and then your average scale weight of week 2 in May to your average scale weight of week 2 in June. And like that, you're giving yourself a 4-week or a 28-day comparison. And do you see where I'm going with this? This is smart because not only are you giving your body a sensible amount of time, you're also comparing scale weight average readings at the same time of your menstrual cycle, which again is going to be a much smarter idea, and it could help save you so much frustration moving forward, because it's not uncommon for many of my Keros Online members who have a menstrual cycle to have their scale weight spike by a bunch during the week of their period, for example. And if they maybe compare that to the day prior or even the week prior, it could be very discouraging. But if they compare it to 4 weeks ago, where they also went through their period, then they can see, oh, it's actually fine. I'm actually heading in the right direction. So this is all good. So that's something to potentially think about moving forward as well, and how you could potentially start taking your scale weight. And then when it comes to potential suggestions for how you can work alongside your menstrual cycle when it comes to resistance training specifically, now we've gotten fat loss out of the way. Like I said, so if you remember when I started, during the follicular phase, so the first 2 weeks, that's when you tend to be at your strongest, that's when injury rates are lowest, that's when coordination is at its best. So with that context considered, it could potentially be a good idea to maybe spend the luteal phase, so again, the final 2 weeks, or even maybe just the last week of the luteal phase, focusing on machine-based exercises, or maybe better yet, perhaps taking a deload week. If you don't know what a deload week is, put simply, it's just a week or just a few sessions where you do a lot less volume, so you would do fewer sets, and you would likely reduce the weight that you're lifting maybe by up to 50%. And then another great tool to potentially focus on during the luteal phase as well is consistency goals. And the reason why I like consistency goals is because at the end of the day, your consistency levels are pretty much going to determine the outcome of any sort of fitness related goal anyway. And I really like this because, number one, you're taking away maybe the fixation on specific fat loss numbers or specific strength gains and how much you should be lifting. And again, you're focusing on something that you should be focusing on anyway, because it's your consistency levels. And at the end of the day, you need good consistency to get to where you need to be anyway. And you could focus on maybe hitting 85 to 95% consistency with a few things, such as maybe your calorie goal or your protein goal or your step goal or working out X number of times weekly. Maybe just focus on being consistent with those things, and that could just be quite a healthy area to put your focus on during the luteal phase. And now I have pretty much covered the bulk of everything I pretty much wanted to cover with you throughout this video. Although before I finish, there is still one potential issue, and it's quite a big issue because it's an important one to speak about, but I want you to be aware of before we finish. And that's that, first of all, so there's actually two things. First of all, it's not hard to imagine that maybe you or someone you know could potentially end up letting your menstrual cycle pretty much dictate exactly every single thing you do when it comes to both resistance training and fat loss. Although, as mentioned before, you are an individual, you are not an average. So with that, there could be your own individual variances as to how you respond. And it could also be quite easy for people who are deemed to have authority within the fitness industry to be selling menstrual cycle based training programs where it might be telling you to train in Y manner during week 1 of the follicular phase and then have X training approach during week 2 of the luteal phase. And that would be quite an effortless money making scheme. Although here's the thing, let's say you're following one of those types of training programs and you're in week 1 of your follicular phase, aka when you're also supposed to be at your most strongest, and it's telling you to max out on a specific lift. But then you had a really poor sleep last night, and as well as that, you're just having a really stressful day, which means that the plan is now causing you to ignore the signals that your body is giving you just because it's telling you to max out a specific lift on a specific time of the month just because your menstrual cycle is telling you to, whereas all the other signs in your body are telling you not to. So instead of getting caught up with all of these factors, here's what I really want you to focus on moving forward when it comes to your training, when it comes to your fat loss, when it comes to your fitness related goals. How do you feel right now? Do you feel good? Do you have energy? Because studies and reports can and should be used as guidelines, but they shouldn't go beyond being used as guidelines. guidelines. Because these guidelines could perhaps work very well 80% of the time, but if in the other 20% of the time you're sleeping very poorly, you've perhaps injured yourself, you've just lost your job, you've had the most stressful day ever, then you certainly shouldn't be trying to max out your lifts, for example. Because nothing is as important as you feel right now and how you react to your own menstrual cycle. Nothing out there overrides that. So to summarize, the trends are very evident when it comes to different studies, which you would do well to take into account when it comes to your fitness, your strength training, your fat loss goals. E.g., you are likely to be stronger and make more gains during the first 2 weeks of your cycle, so the follicular phase, and you are likely to be hungrier or have a higher appetite during the last 2 weeks, your luteal phase. So yes, do use those as valuable guidelines, but remember, the complexity of your life is always going to change day to day, so again, use those as guidelines, not a be-all and end-all. You could even potentially consider using menstrual cycle tracking apps such as Clue or Flow that will also help measure how you feel at different points of your cycle. So ultimately, what I basically want to say is become your own scientist. See where you feel best, see where you feel you're hungriest, see where you feel you're strongest at different points of your menstrual cycle, so that you can help reach your strength training related goals and reach your fat loss related goals. Yes, it's going to take some trial and error at first, but that's okay, because the longer you do it for, the more you start to notice trends, the more you start to notice patterns, and eventually you will figure out what works best for yourself. Otherwise, I hope you found this video helpful. I've never claimed to be an expert in the menstrual cycle, and I wouldn't say I am one. What I am is a very passionate online personal trainer who deeply cares about helping his Kairos Online members reach their own fitness, fat loss, and strength training related goals. So again, if you found this video helpful, please do drop a like on the video, consider subscribing to the channel, and even share it with someone who you know will take immense value from watching this too. Otherwise, take care, and I'll see you around. So just to test it, yeah? Hello and welcome to today's YouTube video about the menstrual cycle. So for today's video, I have decided I'm going to go one step further, and I have got a real life female on her menstrual cycle to help break it. I'm really dedicated to what I do.